For 24 years, an entire generation of American readers thought they had read A Clockwork Orange. They had read about two-thirds of it. The final chapter, the 21st, had been cut from the American edition of the book in 1963, against the author's wishes, because the New York publisher considered it dishonest. Stanley Kubrick, when he adapted the novel for film in 1971, was using the American edition. The film, which became one of the most controversial movies of the 20th century, ended on the ending Anthony Burgess had not wanted. And Burgess spent the rest of his life trying to get the missing chapter and the meaning he had originally written restored to readers in the country where his book had become most famous. This is the story of the chapter Kubrick never read. Anthony Burgess wrote A Clockwork Orange in 3 weeks in late 1961. He was, at the time, a 44-year-old English novelist living in semi-retirement in Sussex, having been told the previous year by his doctors that he had a brain tumor and approximately 12 months to live. The diagnosis turned out to be wrong. He would, in the event, live another 32 years. But the diagnosis was the immediate cause of A Clockwork Orange. Burgess wrote 5 complete novels in that 12-month window on the theory that he needed to leave his wife enough royalties to live on after his death. He wrote in furious bursts, often a chapter a day. He worked on a manual typewriter at his kitchen table. He wrote A Clockwork Orange in 3 weeks. He thought, at the time, that it was the least important of the 5 novels. The book is narrated by a 15-year-old delinquent named Alex, who speaks in an invented teenage Russian English slang called nadsat from the Russian Sussex for the teen years. Alex and his 3 Droogs roam a near-future English city committing acts of ultraviolence. They rob, beat, rape, and murder. Alex is caught after a botched burglary in which an old woman dies. He is sent to prison. In prison, he volunteers for an experimental rehabilitation program called the Ludovico technique, a Pavlovian conditioning treatment that makes him physically sick whenever he attempts an act of violence, including, by accident, when he tries to listen to Beethoven. He is released back into society as a non-violent person. He is immediately attacked by his former victims, who recognize him as helpless. He attempts suicide. The conditioning is reversed by the state for political reasons. He is back to where he started. That, in the American edition and the Kubrick film, is the end. Alex sits in a hospital bed, fantasizes about acts of ultraviolence, and says, in the closing line, "I was cured all right." The implication is that human nature does not change, that violence is permanent, that there is no redemption, that A Clockwork Orange is, in its core argument, a deeply pessimistic book. But here's the part that argument gets wrong. The book Burgess wrote has a chapter 21. In the original British edition, published by Heinemann in 1962, the book is divided into 3 parts of 7 chapters each for a total of 21. The number is not accidental. 21, Burgess told his publishers, is the age at which a young man is traditionally considered to have become an adult. 21 is the threshold of moral responsibility. The structure of A Clockwork Orange is a structure of growing up. 3 parts of 7 chapters each. The book reaches its center at the moment Alex chooses, of his own will, to volunteer for the conditioning. The book moves through the consequences of that choice. And in chapter 21, after Alex has been restored to his preconditioned state, after he is back to running with a new set of Droogs, he meets his old Droog Pete on the street. Pete is married. Pete has a job. Pete has a child on the way. Alex looks at Pete. He goes home alone. He realizes, slowly, in the closing pages, that he is tired of violence. That something in him has shifted. That he might, like Pete, want to settle down. That he is no longer 15. He thinks, in the final paragraph, about having a son of his own one day. That is the chapter 21. That is the entire moral argument of the novel. Burgess's central claim, the one he insisted on for the rest of his life, was that A Clockwork Orange is not a book about whether human nature can be changed. It is a book about whether the state has the right to change human nature when human nature will eventually change on its own. The Ludovico technique is wrong, in Burgess's view, not because it does not work. The book is clear that it works perfectly, but because it removes from a young man the moral act of growing up. Alex, by the end of chapter 21, is becoming a different person by his own slow, painful, freely chosen process. The state intervention in chapter 18 would have prevented that. The choice, the human choice, is the entire point. A man who cannot choose, Burgess argued, is not a man. He is a clockwork orange. A piece of fruit that has been wound up to look alive. Without chapter 21, the book becomes the opposite of what Burgess meant. Without chapter 21, Alex never grows up. Without chapter 21, the argument collapses into nihilism. The book becomes, in Burgess's own bitter phrase, in the preface he wrote in 1986, a fable, an allegory, a parable that has been turned into a piece of pornographic violence. The third prediction is the one that should scare you. Burgess thought, by the end of his life, that the wrong version of his book had won. The American edition outsold the British. The Kubrick film, based on the American edition, was for a long time the only version of the story most viewers ever encountered. The 20-chapter ending, the cynical ending, the ending in which violence is permanent and choice is illusion, became, in popular culture, the canonical A Clockwork Orange. Burgess wrote, in his 1986 preface, that he was being paid royalties for the wrong book. He compared himself, in private letters, to a man who had written a novel about a man dying of cancer and then watched his publishers cut out the recovery. How did the cut happen? The story is now clearer than it was at the time. The American publisher, Swenson at Norton, told Burgess in late 1962 that he thought the final chapter was a sellout. He thought Alex's quiet maturation was unbelievable, that it softened the impact of the violence, that it would not sell. He proposed dropping the final chapter. Burgess, who needed the American advance, who was 45 years old, who was supposedly dying, agreed. He thought, he later said, that it was a small concession. He thought the book would not have a long American life and that the original ending could be restored in a later edition. He was wrong on both counts. The American edition sold. The British edition was forgotten in the United States. The film came 8 years later and used the American text. By the time the chapter could have been restored, an entire generation had read the book without it. Kubrick, asked by Burgess what he thought of the missing chapter, said politely that he had never read it. The book Kubrick had brought home from a New York bookstore in 1969 was the Norton edition. He worked, in his preparation, only from the 20-chapter text. He was apparently genuinely surprised, in the early 1970s, to be told there was more. Burgess campaigned, on and off for the next 2 decades, for the restoration of Chapter 21 in the American editions. He gave interviews. He wrote essays. He published, in 1978, a translation of his own book into French, in which he insisted that the final chapter be retained. He wrote, in his 1986 preface, the angriest single piece of prose of his career. The chapter was finally restored to the American edition in 1986, 24 years after the book was first published in America. The Norton edition is now the standard. If you buy A Clockwork Orange in any English-language bookshop in the world today, you are buying the 21-chapter version that Burgess wrote. But the film, which has been seen many times more than the book has been read, is still the 20-chapter cut. And the cultural memory of A Clockwork Orange, what most people, when asked, would say the book is about, is still the cynical version. Burgess's argument, almost 60 years after the book was published, is still the argument almost no reader actually reads to the end. There is one more piece of this. Burgess himself came, very late in his life, to think that even Chapter 21 was not strong enough. In a long essay published in the 1980s, he wondered whether the entire concept of Alex's redemption, the simple maturation, the boy who one day wants a son of his own, was too easy. He thought, by then, that violence is not something one outgrows. He thought that there is a moral choice every adult must make, every day, between the use of force and the refusal of it. He thought that A Clockwork Orange, even in its full version, made that choice look more automatic than it is. This is the thing the film misses. This is the thing the famous violence misses. A Clockwork Orange is not a celebration of ultraviolence. It is, in its original form, a religious novel about free will. It says, a man without the capacity to choose evil cannot truly choose good. Take away his choice by drugs, by conditioning, by the state, and you have not made him moral. You have made him a piece of clockwork fruit. The Burgess we should be reading is not the Burgess of the film. It is the Burgess of the chapter that Kubrick never opened. If this changed how you think about A Clockwork Orange, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think.